What is soldering? It is a process in which two or more metal items are joined together by melting and flowing a filler metal into the joint, the filler metal having a lower melting point than the workpiece. Soldering differs from welding in that solder does not involve melting the workpieces. Now we will go to the tools and equipment used in soldering. The first tool that we will be discussing is soldering iron. A soldering iron is a hand tool used in soldering. It supplies heat to melt the solder so that it can flow into the joint between two workpieces. A soldering iron is composed of a heated metal tip and an insulated handle. The second one is the soldering gun. A soldering gun is an approximately pistol-shaped tool for soldering metals using tin-based solder to achieve a strong mechanical bond with good electrical contact. The tool has a trigger-style switch, so it can be easily operated with one hand. Solder. Solder is a fusible metal alloy used to join together metal workpieces and having a melting point below that of the workpiece. Alloys that melt between 180 and 190 degrees Celsius are the most commonly used. Flux. A flux is a chemical cleaning agent, flowing agent, or purifying agent. The purpose of flux is to facilitate the soldering process. Next, we will be discussing the accessories used in soldering. Soldering tip. Most soldering irons for electronics have interchangeable tips, also known as bits, that vary in size and shape for different types of work. The picture shows different shape and size of soldering tips, each of which corresponds to a specific function. Next is the soldering pump. The soldering pump, colloquially known as solder sucker, is a manually operated device which is used to remove solder from a printed circuit board. There are two types, the plunger style and bulb style. An electrically operated pump for this purpose would usually be called a vacuum pump. The last one is fume extractor, a device designed to remove harmful fumes caused by solder and flux from the soldering workstation by filtering the air. Fume extraction system removes dangerous smokes and fume caused by lead-free soldering and laser solvents.
Here are the basic soldering procedures. Soldering iron must be tinned before use, especially if the soldering tip is new. First, prepare enough space to work. Next, warm up the iron thoroughly. Make sure that it has fully come to temperature because you're about to melt a lot of solder on it. Third, thoroughly coat the soldering tip in solder. It is very important to cover the entire tip in order to conduct the heat very well. Wipe the tip off on the wet sponge to remove all flux residues. Soldering a PCB is probably the most common soldering task. All surfaces to be soldered should be cleaned well. A clean surface is very important if you want a strong, low-resistance solder joint. Place the components onto the board. For components with long leads such as resistors, it is suitable to bend the leads or legs at an angle. Apply heat to the leads or legs and the board. Apply solder to the joint. Check for cold joints. Check for the connectivity using multimeter. Trim the legs of every component. Another very common task is soldering a joint between two or more wires. Strip the wires to be joined. Twist the wires together. Apply heat to the bottom of the wire joint and use the thicker section of the soldering tip. Apply solder to the joint just above the soldering tip. Clean the flux. Insulate the joint using heat shrink or electrical tape. These are some tips for soldering. Use heat sinks. Keep the iron tip clean. Double check joints. Solder small parts first. Install sensitive components last. And use adequate ventilation.
Here is the actual process of tinning the soldering iron. The entire soldering iron tip is thoroughly coated with the melted solder. After it is totally coated, wipe the tip off the wet sponge.
The second video shows the actual soldering of a PCB. After placing the components onto the board, apply heat to the legs and the board. Apply solder to the joint.
The last video shows the actual soldering of wire joint. The stripped wires are twisted together. Heat is applied to the bottom of the wire joint. Then, the solder is applied. The wire joint is insulated with a heat shrink.